All right, welcome back, everyone. Here we are, second to last week of the weirdest, most traumatic semester many people have had, perhaps in their lives. So I do want to say a few things, again, a number of announcements and things I do want to clear up. First of all, the group project. So again, a reminder that that is due on Thursday by 11:59 p.m. I just opened that up in the assignments. So, and I'll send out this information in an email, but what I'll just have you do is maybe nominate someone from the group that will upload the PowerPoint slides to Turnitin, and you'll upload it as, every group, we'll put it together, or someone, we'll put it together in one presentation. You'll upload it into Turnitin. If you have problems uploading it, maybe convert it into PDF. If all else fails, just email it to me. That's not a problem. So just make sure everyone's names are on their slides. The instructions are still there. Just let me know if there's any problems. Now I know that, some people you haven't been able to get in contact with group members, and the reality is that some students have had to drop, or in sort of adverse conditions, don't know what's going on. So just, move along, without those group members that you're not able to contact. That's not going to be counted against you. So, okay, that's the group project. Just let me know if you have any questions about that. MindTap, I'll be updating the grades for those. There's been some glitches and some problems with some of the analyze questions. I'm going to go and review those and kind of figure out what to do about those. I think most realistically, with the analyze ones, I'll probably just grade based on completion, since it's just, I don't know what's going on. I've contacted them about that. There's just some issues there. The Explore ones, haven't had issues with those. Those have all, worked out well so far. And so anyway, those, catching up on the grading with those, hopefully later this week. Okay, World in Conversation. They should be sending you emails to meet about that. If you haven't gotten one from them or anything, just send them an email. All their information, their contact information, is located at the bottom of the syllabus on campus. Okay, drink a coffee. Okay. So, we are, again, historically chaotic, tough times. If you fail this class and have to take it again, it's going to be completely different next year. Don't fail it, though. But, we'll definitely have to update a lot of things. So right now, today, a little bit behind, going to be talking about crime and drugs and alcohol, and basically combining those two chapters into this one lecture. And then this may go into Thursday a bit too. And then moving into, we jump back to the beginning of the book to chapter 2 on basically, on personal health, on mental health, healthcare, because my initial thinking at the start of the class was we'll talk about all these terrible social issues, and then we'll kind of talk about our own mental and physical health. How do we deal with it at the end of the semester? But it turns out that, our own, that's all going to be like, the sort of number one social problem and issue. Anyway, I'll be talking about that. I'll be talking about some of the things I've been reading about in terms of social networks, isolation, the effect that plagues have had on societies in the past. I've been reading a lot about this over the last couple of weeks. So hopefully these last couple of lectures, which really are just this Thursday and then Tuesday, will focus a lot on personal physical health, mental health, and then the broader healthcare system, which is going to be, I think, totally restructured. Anyway, we'll get there. All right. So, today, drugs, crime, and alcohol. I think the good news for the most part is that crime has been declining. Most types of crime have been declining in rich countries around the world for about the last 30 or 40 years. The bad news is that, COVID-19 just throws up a lot of uncertainty. So we don't know if this trend will continue or change. So kind of connecting the two topics today, I'll talk about crime first and sort of the sociological views on crime, and then talk about drugs. Oh, one last class announcement. So the final exam will be next Thursday. Is that right already? Yes. And again, that will be, all day. We'll be open all day. Everyone will have 2 hours to complete it. It will cover these final chapters, and you see those delineated in the syllabus. Okay, so anyway, connecting the chapter on crime and social control with that on drugs and alcohol is the war on drugs. And, the reality is that, this has been a war that's been going on for 4 decades, basically my entire life, definitely your entire life. And as we'll discuss, it's mostly been a failure. It's succeeded in arresting people for drugs. Whether it's succeeded in reducing drug use is actually is much more debatable. So anyway, we'll get there when we get there. So, okay, first of all, what are we talking about when we talk about crime? Okay, so crime is any sort of, violation of criminal law. What's criminal law? Without going into it too much, criminal law is basically the kind of a accumulation, the aggregation of social behavior, social norms, into what societies deem, what is permissible and what's not. And some of these things are universal, and some are not. Generally we tend to see things like murder and rape as universally punishable, but not always. As I said, these things vary by culture. But for the most part, we've seen we tend to see things. We tend to see a lot of similar behaviors deemed as crime. Theft, for example, is a good example. So when we talk about sort of the United States, and a lot of this lecture will focus on the U.S., we basically divide crimes into felonies and misdemeanors. Felonies, much more serious crimes, murder, rape, robbery, assault, or that sort of thing. Misdemeanors, traffic violations, things that, you generally get a fine for. This is the time where I, ask students to raise their hands if they've ever, gotten a speeding ticket. And, almost everybody raises their hand, just like, oh, a room full of criminals, basically. But anyway, imagine that right now, I suppose. So what are the theories on crime? So they all kind of intersect these days, but you can kind of divide them into 3 different perspectives, 3 different sort of avenues to take that's kind of merged together at some point if we want to get a good picture. But anyway, biological theory. So we look at biological predispositions to criminal behavior, and a lot of this has to do with aggression. So you kind of think about back when we talked about war and aggression there. We talked about testosterone and things like that, and how it's not just testosterone, but exposure to violence and things like that. But there are biological predispositions to aggressive behavior, or I should say, to the capacity for aggressive behavior. But crime isn't just aggressive behavior. You have theft. Then there are people who are just pathologically. Pathologically, I'm going blank on the word, but pathologically steal. They just have to steal, even if they don't necessarily need the items. They're well off financially. They have a pathological urge to steal or do things like that. So there are interesting sort of biological reasons why some people violate norms in general. And some of it has to do with the norms. Sometimes these are strange norms. They're sort of out of line with a lot of human behavior. Sometimes the norms are in line with human behavior, and the behavior of the individual might be a little abnormal. So that's, again, sort of a complex area. It merges into psychological theories, and here we look at individuals, individual personality development, morals, how mental disorders, psychological things, and so on. So this merges then again with biology and with obviously sociological theory. So sociologists, criminologists, we look at kind of big picture then, look at neighborhoods, look at issues of different social groups, poverty, things like that, race, ethnicity, rural versus urban, that sort of thing. We tend to see crime more in urban areas. Well, why is that? Well, density. So we have to be careful, though, because for a long time there was a theory that, well, it must just be density alone that's causing, urban crime and, urban violence in particular, and so on. But those theories have mostly been discredited because there's plenty of places around the world, Tokyo, for example, where you have extraordinarily dense living conditions and, very peaceful, much more peaceful than a spread out place like Detroit, or, comparatively, or Chicago, and so on and so forth. So you combine all these different perspectives, and then you start to have a better understanding of why crime exists. Sometimes it's what we consider crime that's problematic. Sometimes it really is something with the individual. Sometimes it's broader social demographic forces, which we'll talk about. Okay, looking at the different theoretical perspectives, the functionalists basically saying, criminal behavior is normal, it's inevitable. I, for the most part, would agree with this. Basically, the idea that, or agree with the idea that basically people are going to break norms. And one of the things about about growing up and learning how to live in society is you learn from mistakes. So we're going to see that, crime basically, let me back up. Functionalists basically say that, crime helps us in some ways. It's sort of a trial and error process. It helps us kind of figure out what the best rules, ways of doing things are, what should not be allowed. And if we can kind of disallow certain things, then human societies will function more smoothly. So Durkheim was worried that we would enter a state of normlessness. And he was worried worried during the Industrial Revolution that, we would have this state of anomie where nobody could agree upon what's right, what's wrong, and so on and so forth, and that this would lead to crime and deviant behavior in general. And I would say that, we are living in a time of anomie, where, there's a lot of disagreement about what social norms should be. Or I should say that a few months ago, we were living in a state of anomie. Now it's kind of strange, and we'll talk about this more next time and next week. Now we're seeing the restructuring of social norms. So anyway, Dirk, functionalists interested in social behavior, what maintains, smooth functioning of behavior. Robert Merton, famous American sociologist, he looked at the ways in which people try to achieve certain goals, and if their goals if they had trouble achieving those goals, then this would lead to criminal behavior. For example, attaining wealth in our society is a goal, and so if you can't do it through the labor market, through a regular job, maybe you'll try to do it through selling drugs or selling some sort of illegal product, something like that, or robbery or something like this. So he was basically saying that when people can't achieve those goals in society for whatever reason, discrimination, lack of opportunity, and so on, then we have anomie, and then you see more criminal activity. I'm not going to go over this in a lot of detail right now, but Agnew kind of expanded on this and looked at the social psychology of it, and kind of looked at all the different ways in which the people were affected by different stimuli, whether not negative rewards, negative feedback, positive rewards, that sort of thing, and kind of looked at this, kind of looking at it in a more sort of ecological way, I suppose you could say. Social control theorists, another sort of strain of functional theory, kind of look at the different other ways in which behavior is controlled. Now, this is important, I think, for when we think about COVID-19, and when we think about how to regulate social behavior in free, open societies, without being too coercive. We've seen in the last few days several protests around the country, around the United States, people protesting the stay-at-home orders and so on and so forth. So again, you can look at some of this. I'm not going to focus on this too much. This isn't going to show up on the exam. But there are these different ways in which functionalists have thought about social control, and it's something that I've been thinking about more too. And so on. So a lot of it has to do with thinking about our activities and values and norms and beliefs and so on and so forth. So again, I'll kind of return to this when we talk about our own personal and mental health and so on. Okay, conflict theorists, they basically say that, a lot of criminal laws are not there for our own good. A lot of them have been developed basically as a way in which to oppress certain groups and hold certain groups down. And if you look at the history of criminal law, that's hard to argue against that. It's not... a lot of laws have not been there just for the smooth functioning of society. A lot of them have been to entrench the power of certain groups and, keep down other groups and so on and so forth. So this has certainly been, the case, around the world in many ways, where you see in many countries certain ways of practicing religion are illegal, or, excuse me, sexuality, and so on and so forth. So conflict theorists would look at these things and they try to understand laws not just in terms of, the speed limits. They would say, okay, speed limits, that's a sensible, functional law. You're not trying to necessarily, keep down the rights of drivers and things like that. But they would look at laws where people are not allowed to practice their religion and say that, these are coercive laws that are not meant for the smooth functioning of society, that are meant to entrench the power of the dominant religious group or the dominant group who has power, that sort of thing. Feminist perspectives in recent years, we've noticed that crime rates have gone down, but what's been kind of interesting is that female crime rates have actually gone up. And so why that is unclear. It may be because more women are living independently, and so more independence means more opportunity, and more opportunity for engaging in the legitimate labor market, but also in the criminal market as well. So gender shapes crime as well. We see different types of crime being committed by women as opposed to men. So the vast majority of violent crime is committed by men, but we do see women increasingly indicted for things like for smaller misdemeanor offenses, but we are seeing felony offenses rise as well. So where do we get our data on crime? There are a couple of main places. So one primary source of information is the Uniform Crime Report, the UCR. This is what the FBI collects. The FBI collects this from police jurisdictions around the country. So this is basically all of the police reports around the country. So you have index crimes, which are basically a lot of felony crimes. And then you have non-index crimes, which are basically all other crimes. So these are good in the sense that they tend to be fair, they capture those crimes that are committed. However, they only capture those crimes that are reported. So, which is what I meant to say when I said committed. I meant to say reported. They only capture the crimes that are reported. Sorry, I'm just sort of distracted by this family of rabbits of this window in front of my screen, so I'm just watching the wildlife. Pegasus just flew by. Okay, anyway, back to the lecture. So, the problems with the UCR. A lot of crime does not get reported, especially low-level crime. So murders, things like that, those tend to get reported. Car theft, that tends to be reported. When someone, their house is broken into or they're a victim of an armed robbery, we tend to see those types of crimes reported. Not so much property crimes, sexual assaults, although sexual assault reports have increased. They're still not increased enough. So what other measures do we have? The other best measure is the NCVS, the National Crime Victimization Survey. So this is a survey of about 90,000 people, done once a year, and has been done for the last few decades. And so it asks people if they've been victims of crime or not. Now, what's really interesting here is that when you compare the NCVS results and the UCR results, so the NCVS is just calling people, you have random samples of people, asking them, if they've been victims of property crime, of burglary, of, this or that. And then the UCR, which is crimes reported to the police, they actually track fairly well. I mean, not exactly, so you have different numbers, but the rates are pretty similar. So yeah, when you have upticks in crimes reported to the police in the UCR, you also have upticks in people reporting that they've been victimized in the NCVS. So actually those two measures together provide a pretty good measure of actual crime rates in the United States. Violent crime, as I said, we tend to see that males tend to be victimized more, except when it comes to rape and sexual assault. And we talked about rape and sexual assault earlier. Younger people more likely to experience violent crime, also more likely to commit violent crime. So again, here's some sociobiology. I think I talked about this when we talked about war as well, but we see violent crime and just violence in general drops quite dramatically after men turn 25. Not for everybody, obviously, but for most men. Aggressive behavior in general kind of falls after age 25. What happens then? Your prefrontal cortex is finished, forming. So basically, that controls a lot of risky behavior or moral judgment and a lot of things that's associated with aggressive behavior. So it's not just that though, but that's one thing that happens. So we see that when people get into their late 20s, early 30s, crime goes down. Property crime, this is the vast majority of crime in the United States. And I'm sad to say, not proud to say, but your professor used to be a petty criminal in his youth and used to be somewhat of a vandal in his teen years and did stupid things, broke other people's stuff for no reason. I thought I was doing something. I don't know what I thought. I can't really rationalize it. But anyway, one of those young punk kids out there who was doing petty acts of crime back in the 1990s when we had less to do, evidently, because property crime has been declining since then. So, and here we can see this is looking at crime rates, property and violent crime rates. This is looking at the UCR data, and if you were to look at the NCVS data, it's basically the same. So you see this drop going on since the 1990s. Okay, so what's going on? You see it happening basically in other cities as well. You see crime was going up in the 1980s. It really kind of peaks. Then it falls, and it falls dramatically in some places. Chicago, not so much. And actually, if you were to continue this chart, you see an uptick in Chicago. You still see declines in Houston, New York, and Los Angeles. Okay, so I think the one thing that's important. Okay, so we see crime falling throughout the 1990s into the 2000s. And so why is that? Well, one explanation is that, must be it's the drug war. We were locking up people, so we saw prison rates go up. That's definitely part of it. We're locking up violent criminals, and if you don't have people, especially people that are repeated violent offenders, if you lock them up, obviously you're going to see a reduction in those crime rates. But that's not enough to explain just the huge declines in all sorts of crime. I mean, all sorts of property crime, larceny, forgeries, drug crimes, just a whole range of crimes have fallen since the 1990s. What happened? What's going on here? So the first thing to say is, what's going on in other rich countries? That's, I think, oftentimes I think the first thing we should ask ourselves when we're looking at any sort of rates is, is this unique to the United States or whatever country we're talking about, or do we see the same thing in countries that have similar economies and education levels and so on? Well, if we look at the G7, this is looking at other some of the other richest countries in the world, and you actually, if you were to look at the G20, the top richest countries in the world roughly, you see the same thing. You see that since the 1990s, this big drop in all sorts of crimes, big drop in robbery and homicides, huge decline in vehicle theft. So it's not limited to the United States. So it's not just something about American policy. There is something going on in other rich countries that do not have the criminal policies and the criminal justice system that the United States does. Other countries, Canada, Britain, France, Germany, so on, have been able to reduce their crime rates quite dramatically as well, without locking people up in the same numbers. So what's going on there? Again, let's take a look and see what was happening before. Just looking at the UCR data, going back to the 1960s, you got from the 1960s up until 1990, you have a rise in in violent crimes and property crimes. 1990 happens, then boom, you have this decline. Remember, this happens in other countries in the world too. What's going on here? So let me see where I'm going here. Okay. Here's where demography comes in. So again, remember we talked about population. Population is so important. Population explains crime rates more than anything else. So right here, 1960s to 1980s, what's going on here? The baby boomers are coming of age. Remember, people are basically more likely to commit crime between the ages of 15 to 25, basically, mostly men. So in rich countries in the United States, you've got this baby boom of the population. So you've got this boom of youngsters, of young men out there. And the baby boom basically comes to an end. Here you've got the millennials in the 1990s and the 2000s. You've got the millennials and now Generation Z that are coming of age. So this was a smaller cohort. So that's one thing that's going on, one big thing that's going on. You have this big bulge of young men out there, with nothing to do, causing crimes and so on. So that's a big part of it. Now, that's part of the reason you have this rise in crime going on here. So you have the reduction in family size, and so that leads to a reduction in crime rates. So there's a couple of things that are going on here too. Lead poisoning. There's been some interesting research showing associations between the fall in lead poisoning and fall in crime rates. That cities that started removing lead from their buildings and started moving proactively on lead pollution, lead poisoning, and so on, saw reductions in criminal behavior and all sorts of other health behavior. So that's part of it too. Abortion plays a role in a very interesting way. Abortion becomes legal in the United States in 1972. Who is usually getting aborted? Often unwanted children that are born out of wedlock. So what do we know just from the sociology of family and so on? Well, we know that oftentimes, as we talked about before, not often, but and oftentimes, especially in the 1960s and 70s, that children who were, excuse me, who were born out of wedlock and unwanted, did not have good upbringings. They usually were born in unstable conditions and so on and so forth. The mother was in poverty, that sort of thing. They grew up in a poor neighborhood. They had poor friends, and therefore, they were more likely to engage in criminal behavior and so on. So the legalization of abortion leads to the ability to abort unwanted children. So this is not, I should stop here and say this is not a argument for or against abortion. This is just sort of a clinical, analytical, sort of mathematical understanding of the impact of abortion on crime rates. So the legalization of abortion happens in 1972, and we start to see crime rates falling in about the time that a lot of those kids who in the following years would have been, the kids who were aborted would have come of age and probably have been committing crimes on the streets. Why do we think this? Well, there's some evidence to suggest that this is the case. So there were 3 states that legalized abortion about 3 to 5 years before Roe v. Wade, before it became national. We saw that crime rates started falling in those 3 states 3 to 5 years before the rest of the country did. And we can look at this internationally and see sort of similar trends. So that's very interesting. Now, there are caveats with that. That is not the only explanation, but it's part of it. It's not, as I said, it's not a pro-anti-abortion argument. It's just one of those things that we see. It's kind of like how saving poor children in overpopulated countries actually reduces the population growth rate. Because over time people then have smaller families. It's just sort of this counterintuitive thing that you don't really think about. So again, abortion should not be used as like a crime prevention policy or something. And we don't know if that's something that will continue. What I think would be interesting is that in states we've seen where there's been a reduction in abortion clinics, like Texas or Mississippi, for example, over the last few years. Will we see their crime rates, increase in the next 10 or 15, 20 years or so? Again, stuff to look at. So again, abortion plays a role, but the lead poisoning plays a role. The bigger thing, though, is just the demographic change that you have happen here. You also have a growing economy. You also have increasing the social connection, and I think that's the really important thing that is sometimes left out. Increasingly, also because of social media, we're all connected to each other, and you don't want to necessarily be known as the local criminal, that sort of thing. Okay, so one of the things, though, that's a problem around the world is prison occupancy. So we see in many places there are a lot of countries where they're just overflowing. They're at capacity or overflowing. The United States, we're basically overflowing. We're right at capacity, but a few years ago, this is 2012 actually, so yeah, we are actually over capacity now. The California State Supreme Court basically mandated that they had to figure something out because it was becoming inhumane, the prison conditions there. Right now we've got a problem too because COVID-19 is taking off in the prison population. Okay, juvenile delinquency. So one of the things, just, in my own life, as I said, I was a bit of a petty criminal when I was a teenager, and I had friends who were petty criminals as well. And I think, the big difference in our lives ended up being that I, went on to college and, was actually motivated to go into psychology because I was interested in, why so many of my friends had gone in a very different direction, had basically went into a life of crime. And, and and trying to understand juvenile delinquency and this sort of thing. And I know that a lot of you that are in criminology and sociology are sort of interested in this. So again, as I said, juvenile delinquency, overwhelmingly male. We're seeing we're seeing female crime rates increase, but we're seeing a lot of crime happens young men. Again, very, very gender dimension to that. So when we talk about crime, though, we have to talk about white collar crime. And here, I think, what's going to be really interesting is that we're going to see, I think, in the coming months and years ahead, a huge decline, a continued decline in, crime such as robbery and burglary and stuff like that, because we're all worried about COVID-19 and so on. But we may see a huge increase in white collar crime. I think we're going to see, all sorts of, companies and people within companies take advantage of, the just people's ignorance, all sorts of online scams and so on and so forth. We're already seeing, I think, a lot of bad behavior going on with some of the bailouts and so on. Not criminal, but definitely borderline immoral. Well, immoral and maybe borderline criminal, but we'll see what happens there. So what are the ways in which we usually see white collar crime? Most often workplace safety violations, and we're going to see a huge new regime of workplace safety regulations put into place. Now, some companies may be opposed to this, but I think, it's going to be sort of, until we figure out coronavirus, it's going to be, something we just need to work on. Excuse me. Got a bit of a cough, and I hope it's just this allergies and cold air. Let me just turn on my heater. I got the heater on. I hope that's not too noisy. Okay. Other things, environmental crimes, that's a big one. Pollutions and all sorts of cover-ups over pollution crimes. I've been dismayed by the Trump administration's decision to basically waive all EPA regulations right now. So companies can pollute all they want. The good news, I suppose, there is that there's not much economic activity happening, so there's actually not much pollution to happen. But if all of a sudden you see companies start dumping into fresh water during a pandemic or something, this could be a bad situation. So we also know that we're starting to see a correlation between COVID-19 deaths and air pollution. So if we're going to be, cutting air pollution, anyway, save that tangent for some other time or not. For the most part, we see a lot of white-collar crimes happening with environmental crimes and tax evasion. That's a big one. The fantastic movie about this that you could watch on Netflix, The Laundromat, about the huge money laundering scam, and just how companies and rich celebrities and all these people were, sending all this money to Panama. You may have heard of the Panama Papers, and that's basically what this is about, from a few years ago. It's just an incredibly interesting story, and it's kind of infuriating if when you see what people are allowed to get away with when you have lots of money, basically. And a lot of it has to do with tax evasion. So that's a big one too, is that, when you're wealthy, you can kind of play around with your money and kind of hide it away from the government more easily than, if you're middle class or something. Okay. There's also within companies, so you have companies themselves that can, be engaged in criminal activity, but you've also got crimes happening within companies. So I thought this was interesting, and I need to sort of get an update. But this is kind of, the crimes that you saw before the economic crash 10 years ago. I think that's interesting because you see sort of a rise in accounting and bribery and corruption, basically from 2003 up to the recession, the financial crash, and so on. It'd be interesting to see something like this going up to now. Cyber crimes, this is actually one area where we do actually see increases. So we're seeing decreases in physical property crime, violent crime, and so on, increases in cyber crime. And we're going to see this area rise. So those of you who are majoring in cybersecurity and stuff like that, you probably got some job security. I know Zoom needs some more need some more officials to work on their security glitches and so on. I'll be adopting Zoom once they've worked out some of that stuff. So, cybercrime, as I said, we're going to see this, especially as, people are trying to access their stimulus money or things like that, and you're going to see all sorts of scams and all sorts of stuff. So anyway, you got surveillance capitalism on the one hand, and you got cybercrime going on. So, the online cyber world, well, it's kind of an anarchic place right now. Okay, so one of the biggest cyber, hacks in history was Target. They were hit really hard a number of years ago in 2013, and this was sort of a wake-up call to the rest of corporate, the corporate world, that huge companies are not immune from some of these cyber attacks. So right now, just going to talk a little bit about policing. Actually, I'm going to pause this for 1 second and fill up my water. Alright, everyone, just have to refill my water and coffee. Okay, so looking at the responses to crime, looking at the police, so police forces, if you remember, we talked about government as basically, having the monopoly on the use of violence. So the police is sort of part of that, and the police at a fundamental sort of sociological level is kind of part of the military. But at a kind of functional level, we have them, they're separated. They have different responsibilities, functions, and so on and so forth. So what we've seen in recent years, and I think one of the things that we try to stress in the criminology program at Penn State, and really I think criminal justice programs around the country, is community policing. So this has also been probably one thing that has helped reduce crime rates over the years, and that's to increase the interaction between officers and citizens, to try to build trust in communities and places especially where there's been a lack of trust. So, huge, racial divides and disproportionate treatment of racial minorities in the United States, and minorities around the world tend to be treated more harshly by police forces. So there's some of this us them that happens, and unfortunately some of that plays out in police officers' minds. not all police officers. And here you can see, looking at, the trust in police levels between blacks and whites in the United States. A great deal, some very little or none. You see a big difference between black and white people. There's, way more African Americans who have very little to no trust or confidence in the police as opposed to the white population. And as Black Lives Matter showed, there's good reason for that. Now, and this is very important too, whenever we talk about this, it's very easy to scapegoat all police forces. And I think, a lot of police feel that they are, being unfairly maligned for the actions of a few bad apples, or for the actions of institutional systems that they don't necessarily have a lot of control over individually. And while we need to recognize that and be aware of that, I think one of the things that, those of us who are teaching future law enforcement officers need to do is also recognize that we hold law enforcement officers to a higher standard than your regular average citizen. So even though law enforcement officers are working under conditions of, incredible stress and so on, that should not be an excuse for unlawful shootings or police brutality and so on and so forth. One of the things, I'll get there. There are a number of things that we can do to reduce the stress of police officers and reduce, I believe we could reduce brutality and things like that. So just talking about the sort of structure of law enforcement in the United States, the Department of Justice. You have various different agencies. Some of you are, learning about government organizations and so on. I'm not going to spend much time on that. So do prisons work? This is the big question. Well, yes and no. I mean, yes, in the sense that people who are just serial criminals who just do not seem to ever do anything else, locking them up does seem to, end the problem. And as I said, we can look at charts like this and say, well, it looks like locking people up, that has led to the crime rate. Except when you look at the data a bit more closely. Because what we see is that, yes, we see that inmates, the number of inmates is going up. But remember, a lot of these people are getting out too, and going back in. So we know that also recidivism is high. Recidivism means people that go in and out of prison, basically. And so one of the problems we're getting better in this country, but especially back in the 1970s and 80s and 90s, was that people would they would go to, they'd get busted for some low-level drug offense like marijuana or something, and then they would be put in jail and meet some hardened crack dealers or something like this. Then they get into that, and pretty soon they're much more hardened criminals and so on. It becomes this sort of self-perpetuating cycle. So when we see the growth in the prison population, it has definitely played a role in reducing crimes, but it's not very clear-cut how, because we also know that it plays a role in increasing crimes because it increases recidivism. You get people around other criminals, people get a criminal record, it gets harder for them to get a good job, they end up getting jobs where there's other people with criminal records, etc., etc. And here's the problem. So when we look at a lot of the people who have been put in prison, about half of them are drug offenders, nonviolent drug offenders, most of them. So that's problematic because it's a huge waste of resources. And we look at other countries that look at drug use as more of a health issue, then we start to see that they have better outcomes. They're more successful in reducing drug use and things like that. This is looking at what people look based on census data. Sorry, nature is going on outside and outside the window. I'm usually not here during this time of the day, so I wasn't aware of all the unicorns that are in my backyard and so on. Okay, anyway, so when we look at this chart, for example, we see that drug offenses are what land people in federal prisons. You see that for admissions there, that top bar here, that immigration is a pretty big one. But you see in terms of the total population, it's a pretty small percentage of the federal prisoners. Big percentage of those release, and people could be like, what are they doing releasing, people who have been, in prison for, violation of immigration laws? Well, they're usually not being released just, onto the streets. They're usually being deported. Usually, I mean almost always. Drug offenses, that's another area where we see a lot of releases. Not so much violence. So again, a lot of the drug population, a lot of the population of our prisons right now are for drug offenses. So I think this is an important one, and here's where I think we could also help out our police officers a lot. So back in the 1950s, oh, sorry, I've got to pause this lecture. Sorry, had a delivery there. Okay, so we see in the 1950s and 1960s, America starts closing down mental health hospitals. A lot of state psychiatric hospitals were closed, and you see this rise in the prison population. So what's going on here? First of all, I want to say that that these mental hospitals of this time period, the 1930s through the 1960s, were not good places for people to be, especially if you had mental illness. This was the age of electroshock therapy, of just really bad treatments, and they would just give you all sorts of meds, and kind of lock you up for things that you probably shouldn't be there for. However, during this time period of the last few decades, our understanding of human psychology has just increased by quite a bit. However, we don't have a lot of good mental health care facilities, and they're expensive, so a lot of people won't go to them, or can't afford to go to them, I should say. So a lot of people with severe mental illnesses end up on the streets. I mean, the homeless population overwhelmingly is made up of people who are suffering from schizophrenia, borderline personality disorder. Some of these ones that are very severe, that you need medication for, and so they end up on the streets, or they end up in sort of petty crimes and so on. And who ends up having to handle them? Police officers. And police officers are trained to do a lot of things, but they're not trained to be psychiatrists. Some of you are going into psychology, and you know that you have to take several years to get your bachelor's degree, and then another few years to get a master's, or PhD if you're going more beyond that. In other words, you have to take a lot of schooling to work with people who have psychiatric health issues. And we're putting police on the front lines of our mental health crisis without that training. And we're asking them to do way too much, in my opinion. So I think we could actually help out our police officers if we could work on our mental health issues. And I'll be talking about that on Thursday and next time. Okay, let's see. The prisons, I'm not gonna go over this slide. You can read it in the modules. I talked about the community approaches to law enforcement. the death penalty. This is another area where we see changes happening in the United States, where the death penalty, it's decreasing in its usage, also in popularity. So people are now turning against the death penalty in greater numbers. A lot of this has happened because we've started to become better at recognizing that we've killed a lot of people, a lot of innocent people in this country because of, just lack of DNA testing. Now that we have better DNA testing and we can, recognize, the real criminals better. Okay, so this was where I asked if you've ever been arrested, see how many criminals are in the class, always sort of interested in that. I asked who's been doing drugs and so on and so forth. Okay, so I think right now I am going to, I'll stop here for today. I'm going to finish up by talking about drugs and alcohol usage, and basically kind of use that as kind of a way to segue into our personal mental health. Basically, I'll start by talking about what not to do for your mental health, basically. And then, segue into chapter 2, and then talk about health, mental, physical health, our healthcare system, and COVID-19. So Thursday and next Tuesday, I'll be covering a lot of information. The other thing I want to say is on Thursday I'll be posting the study guide for the final exam, and I will be making myself available on Canvas chat during my office hours next week and during class next week, and I'm mostly available via email and so on. So again, I'll end it here for today. Hang in there, everybody, and we will muddle through.